She was born into one of the richest families in American history, a name that once meant railroads, steel, power, and unimaginable wealth. And yet, she never truly owned her life. This is not a story about money. It's a story about control, about how having everything can still mean having nothing. Because Gloria Vanderbilt inherited millions, but never the authority to decide what to do with them. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why money without power is one of the most dangerous illusions ever created. Most people believe wealth equals freedom, that if you have enough money, doors open, choices expand, life becomes yours. But Gloria Vanderbilt's life tells a very different story. Her story asks an uncomfortable question. What if money doesn't liberate you, but traps you? What if inheritance isn't a gift, but a leash? And what if the people who claim to protect you are the ones who benefit most from keeping you powerless? To understand Gloria Vanderbilt, we have to begin before she ever had a voice, before she could speak, before she could choose, before she even understood what her last name meant. Because from the moment she was born, her life was already being negotiated. Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was born in 1924. She entered the world carrying one of the most famous surnames in America. The Vanderbilt family fortune began with Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who transformed shipping, railroads, and industry into an empire. At its peak, the Vanderbilt wealth was so vast that it helped shape New York itself. Grand Central Terminal, entire neighborhoods, an American dynasty. By the time Gloria was born, the fortune had already begun to fracture, split, spent, diluted across generations. But there was still more money than most people could comprehend. Enough to make a child a target. Enough to make a child a prize. Gloria's father died when she was just a baby. Her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was young, beautiful, and deeply embedded in high society. To the public, she looked glamorous, but behind closed doors, she was unstable, reckless, and dangerously impulsive. And soon, whispers began to follow her. About her spending, her relationships, her priorities, and, most importantly, about her ability to care for her daughter. This is where the story changes, because Gloria Vanderbilt didn't grow up quietly behind mansion walls. She grew up in headlines. When concerns about her mother's behavior escalated, the family stepped in. Specifically, Gloria's aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a woman of status, power, and influence. She believed the child needed to be saved. But saved for whom? What followed was one of the most sensational custody battles of the 20th century. A public trial, front-page news, society watching closely as two wealthy women fought over one small girl. But this was never just about love. It was about control of a trust fund worth millions of dollars, money that legally belonged to Gloria, but could only be accessed by whoever controlled her. Imagine this. You are 4 years old. You sit silently in a courtroom while adults argue over your future. Your name is spoken, debated, analyzed, but your voice is never heard. Strangers decide where you will live, who will raise you, who will manage your money, all while newspapers turn your childhood into entertainment. Gloria Vanderbilt became known as the poor little rich girl, but there was nothing poor about her finances, only her freedom. The court ultimately ruled against her mother. Custody was taken away and given to her aunt. To the public, this looked like a victory. Stability over chaos, structure over recklessness. But for Gloria, it was simply a transfer of ownership. One authority replaced another. And the trust fund, the fortune everyone claimed was for her benefit, remained firmly out of her hands. Here's the cruel irony. The money was legally hers, but every dollar came with conditions. Trustees, guardians, rules, permission. She could not touch her wealth without approval. She could not live freely without supervision. She could not even define herself without someone else deciding what was appropriate. This is the moment where most people misunderstand her story. They hear millionaire child and imagine privilege. But privilege without agency? is just a more comfortable cage, and Gloria Vanderbilt's cage was built with silk, marble, and legal documents. As she grew older, the world expected gratitude. After all, wasn't she lucky? Educated abroad, surrounded by art, protected from bad influences? But protection quickly became surveillance. Her behavior was monitored, her relationships questioned, her choices restricted. The trust fund that was meant to secure her future was quietly shaping it instead, not around her desires, but around everyone else's fears. By the time Gloria reached adolescence, one truth was becoming painfully clear. She was rich in name only. She didn't own her money. She didn't own her image. And most importantly, she didn't own herself. And the most devastating part? She was told this was love, that control was care, that restriction was safety, that obedience was gratitude. And so Gloria Vanderbilt learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that survival sometimes means silence. But this silence wouldn't last forever, because eventually she would try to escape, through art, through love, through ambition. And when she finally earned her own money, real money, made by her own hands, she would discover something shocking. Freedom isn't inherited, it's fought for. And that fight was only just beginning. By the time Gloria Vanderbilt was old enough to understand what money meant, she had already learned what it could take away. Because her fortune was never designed to empower her, it was designed to contain her. Trust funds are often described as protection, a safety net, a shield against recklessness, a way to preserve wealth across generations. But for Gloria Vanderbilt, the trust fund was something else entirely. It was a system of control wrapped in the language of care. Legally, the money belonged to her, but legally did not mean practically. Every decision passed through someone else. Trustees managed the accounts, guardians approved expenses, advisors defined what was appropriate, and every request came with scrutiny, not because the money was scarce, but because power was. Gloria couldn't simply decide to live where she wanted. She couldn't choose her own lifestyle freely. Even her education, travel, and personal spending were filtered through adult permission. Imagine being told your entire life that you are wealthy, and yet needing approval to access what is supposedly yours. This is how financial control really works. It doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten. It quietly limits your options until compliance feels natural. The people around Gloria insisted this was for her own good, that without boundaries she would be corrupted, that money, left unchecked, would ruin her. But no one asked a more dangerous question. What happens when control ruins the person instead? As Gloria entered her teenage years, she began to feel the weight of expectations. She wasn't just a girl, she was a Vanderbilt. Her behavior reflected on the family. Her reputation carried financial implications. Her mistakes could become scandals. And scandals, to those in charge, were risks. So her life became carefully curated. Who she spent time with, what she wore, where she went, even how she expressed herself. The trust fund wasn't just guarding money, it was guarding an image. And slowly, something inside her began to fracture. Because when you're never allowed to decide for yourself, you don't learn judgment, you learn obedience. And obedience doesn't prepare you for adulthood, it prepares you for dependency. Gloria Vanderbilt was being shaped into a symbol, not a person, a reminder of legacy, a vessel of inheritance. But symbols don't get to ask questions, and vessels don't get to choose direction. As she grew older, Gloria began searching for exits. Not dramatic escapes, small ones, private ones, places where control loosened, even briefly. Art became one of those places. Painting, writing, expression without permission. In art, no one needed to approve her feelings. No trustee could deny a brushstroke. For the first time, she could create something that belonged only to her. But creativity doesn't pay trust fund bills, and it certainly doesn't buy independence. Not yet.
Then came modeling. Her face, already familiar to society pages, became her own asset. Work gave her something the trust never did: agency. She wasn't asking for money, she was earning it.
And that distinction mattered, because earned money behaves differently. It answers to you. It reflects your effort, your risk, your choice. For Gloria, this was intoxicating. For the people who controlled her trust, it was threatening. Independence disrupts systems built on dependency, and suddenly Gloria's pursuit of work was no longer encouraged. It was questioned, monitored, discouraged. The message was subtle but clear. You don't need this. You already have money. But Gloria understood something crucial. Having money is not the same as controlling it. As she entered adulthood, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. She was expected to behave like a responsible adult, yet she was treated like a permanent child. Her finances still overseen, her decisions still evaluated, her freedom still conditional. This is where many people break. Some rebel loudly, others collapse inward. Gloria did something else. She adapted. She married. Love, she believed, might offer escape, a partnership, a shared life, someone who would see her not as a fortune, but as a woman. But power has a way of following those who never learn to wield it, and control, once normalized, often reappears in new forms. Gloria would marry more than once, and again, she found herself drawn into relationships where authority quietly shifted away from her. Different men, same imbalance. This is not coincidence, it's conditioning. When your first experience of money is powerlessness, you don't associate wealth with autonomy. You associate it with oversight. By the time Gloria reached her 30s, she had lived a life that looked extraordinary from the outside. Fame, beauty, connections. But internally, she was still chasing something simple: control. And then, finally, she found it. Not in inheritance, not in marriage, but in work. When Gloria Vanderbilt launched her own fashion line, something unprecedented happened. She didn't just sell clothes, she sold herself, her name, her taste, her decisions. For the first time, money flowed toward her because of who she was, not who she belonged to. The success was massive. Her jeans became iconic, and the irony was impossible to miss. She made more money on her own than the trust fund had ever given her access to. But even success has shadows, because freedom, when it arrives late, comes with scars. And Gloria Vanderbilt was about to learn that escaping financial control doesn't erase its psychological cost. The trust fund had shaped her instincts, her relationships, her fears, and no amount of money could undo that overnight. The question now wasn't, could Gloria be free? It was, what does freedom even look like to someone who has never truly had it? And the answer to that question would define the rest of her life. When freedom finally arrives, late in life, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things are dangerous to people who were trained to obey. By the time Gloria Vanderbilt began earning real money on her own, she was no longer a child trapped in legal structures. She was an adult, carrying the psychological weight of them. The trust fund no longer dictated her every move, but its influence hadn't disappeared. It had simply moved inside her. Her success in fashion was undeniable. The Gloria Vanderbilt name, once a symbol of inherited wealth, became a commercial force. Her jeans weren't just popular, they were revolutionary. For the first time, a woman's name was printed boldly on the back pocket and sold as confidence, sexuality, and power. Millions of women wore her brand. Millions of dollars followed. From the outside, this looked like liberation. The lost heiress had finally reclaimed her fortune. But internally, the story was far more complicated. Because money earned later in life doesn't automatically undo lessons learned early. Gloria had learned to survive under control. Not to lead, not to dominate, to adapt. and adaptation is not the same as authority. Her business success brought independence, but it also brought exhaustion. Decision-making felt heavy. Responsibility felt unfamiliar. When you grow up without agency, choice doesn't feel empowering. It feels risky. And so, even as she controlled her brand, she often surrendered control elsewhere, especially in love. Gloria married multiple times. Each relationship carried hope that this time would be different, that partnership would mean balance, that intimacy would bring safety, not dominance. But patterns repeat when they are never examined, and Gloria's early life had trained her to equate love with oversight, protection with restriction, care with control. Some of the men in her life managed finances, others managed decisions. Some offered guidance that slowly became authority.
And Gloria, accustomed to someone else holding the reins, often allowed it, not because she was weak, but because it felt normal. This is the quiet tragedy of inherited powerlessness. You don't rebel against it. You recreate it. Despite her wealth, despite her fame, despite her achievements, Gloria Vanderbilt continued to feel emotionally dependent. And dependency, even when voluntary, comes at a cost. Still, she worked, she created, she wrote. Art remained her refuge. In writing, she could finally tell her own story without edits, without approvals, without permission. And yet, the deeper she moved into adulthood, the more fragile her personal world became. Loss followed success. Relationships ended, trust eroded, and the family legacy that once defined her offered no comfort. Then came the greatest loss of all, one that no fortune could soften, one that no success could shield her from. Her son, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, struggled with depression, despite access to resources, despite a famous name, despite a mother who loved him deeply. In 1988, Carter died by suicide. He was just 23 years old. This moment shattered Gloria Vanderbilt completely, because it confronted her with the final, brutal truth. Money cannot protect what power cannot heal. She had inherited wealth, she had earned success, she had survived control, and yet she could not save her child. The pain was public, the grief unbearable, and once again her life became a story others consumed. But this time Gloria didn't retreat into silence. She wrote, she spoke, she faced the tragedy openly, not as an heiress, not as a brand, but as a mother. In her grief, something shifted. The need to please faded. The fear of judgment weakened. Because when you lose everything that matters, control loses its power over you. Gloria Vanderbilt spent her later years reflecting on her life with clarity. She spoke openly about her childhood, about the custody battle, about the trust fund, about how money had shaped her in ways no one could see from the outside. She didn't romanticize her inheritance. She didn't glorify wealth. Instead, she warned about it. She understood something most people never do, that the greatest danger of money is not losing it. It's losing yourself because of it. By the end of her life, Gloria Vanderbilt was no longer defined by what she inherited. She was defined by what she endured. But her story doesn't end with her, because the final irony of control was still waiting, and it would be revealed through the one thing she left behind, her legacy. And that legacy would raise one final question. Did Gloria Vanderbilt ever truly escape the system that controlled her? Or did it simply pass on to the next generation? That answer comes next. Every story about inheritance eventually reaches the same moment, the moment where control must be passed on or released. By the time Gloria Vanderbilt reached the final decades of her life, she had lived longer outside the shadow of her trust fund than within it. She had built her own career, earned her own wealth, defined herself beyond her last name. And yet, the question of inheritance returned, not as memory, but as responsibility. Because Gloria Vanderbilt was no longer the child in the courtroom, She was now the one deciding what would be left behind. Her estate was significant, not just in monetary terms, but in cultural weight. Her name still carried history. Her story still carried meaning. And the world assumed that her wealth would follow tradition, that it would be passed down, protected, preserved. But Gloria had learned something most dynasties never do, that inheritance can be a burden, and that money, when given without agency, can quietly destroy the people it is meant to help. She had watched her own childhood become a battleground over assets. She had watched control masquerade as care, and she had lived the consequences. So when it came time to decide how her wealth would be distributed, Gloria Vanderbilt made a choice that surprised many. Her son, Anderson Cooper, would not inherit the majority of her fortune, not because of conflict, not because of distance, but because of intention. She believed something radical, that the greatest gift a parent can give is not money, it's autonomy. Anderson Cooper has spoken openly about this, about how his mother believed in building your own life, about how she feared that unearned wealth could distort identity. This was not punishment, it was protection, but this time, protection without control. Unlike Gloria's childhood, there were no trust funds designed to manage behavior, no guardians defining acceptable choices, no money held hostage to obedience. Gloria Vanderbilt refused to repeat the cycle. And yet, the irony remains. Her life became famous because of an inheritance she never controlled. Her identity was shaped by wealth that restricted her, and she is remembered for strength that money had nothing to do with. The Vanderbilt fortune, once vast beyond imagination, had already faded by the time she died, spent across generations, diluted by time. But its psychological legacy endured. Because money leaves traces long after it disappears, in expectations, in behavior, in fear. Gloria Vanderbilt's life stands as a warning, not about greed, not about extravagance, but about the quiet damage done when power is removed from the person it supposedly serves. She proved that you can survive wealth, that you can outgrow inheritance, that you can redefine legacy. But she also proved that control, once learned, is hard to unlearn. Her story forces us to confront a truth we rarely acknowledge, that wealth, without agency, is not a privilege, it's a psychological experiment, and most people never realize they're participating. The final irony of Gloria Vanderbilt's life is this: she spent decades fighting to control her own story, and in the end, she used the only power she had left to make sure someone else wouldn't have to. That decision may not have made headlines, but it may have been her greatest act of freedom. Which brings us to the real meaning of her life, not as an heiress, not as a designer, not as a public figure, but as proof that freedom is not inherited, it is built. And that leads to one final question. A question that matters far beyond the Vanderbilt name. What would your life look like if money never decided who you were allowed to become? Gloria Vanderbilt's story is uncomfortable because it challenges something we want to believe: that money solves problems, that wealth creates freedom, that inheritance is a blessing. Her life tells us otherwise. It shows us that money on its own has no moral direction. It doesn't protect, it doesn't guide, it doesn't love. It amplifies whatever system controls it. In Gloria's childhood, money amplified surveillance. In her adulthood, it amplified expectations. And only when she earned her own wealth did it begin to resemble freedom. But even then, freedom was incomplete, because power, once removed early, leaves an imprint, and no amount of success can fully erase that. This is why her story still matters, not because she was rich, but because she was restrained. Most people will never inherit millions, but many inherit something else: expectations, obligations, roles they didn't choose, families that decide who they should be, systems that reward obedience,
rules disguised as protection. Gloria Vanderbilt's life asks us to look closer, to question whether what we call security is actually control, to ask whether comfort has quietly replaced autonomy. Because the most effective prisons don't look like prisons.
They look like stability. They tell you, you're lucky, you're protected, you don't need more. And slowly, they teach you not to ask. Gloria spent her life learning what happens when asking is discouraged, and what it costs to finally start asking anyway. She lost time, she lost relationships, she lost a son, and still, she chose not to pass that burden forward. That choice is her real inheritance, not money, not fame, but awareness. Awareness that freedom isn't about access, it's about authority. The authority to choose, the authority to fail, the authority to define yourself without permission. This is why her story lingers, because somewhere inside it is a warning meant for all of us. If you don't control your resources, they will control you. If you don't define your life, someone else will do it for you. And if you mistake comfort for freedom, you may never realize what you've lost. Gloria Vanderbilt lived inside one of the greatest fortunes America ever created, and she spent most of her life trying to escape its shadow. Not everyone gets that chance. So the question her life leaves us with is simple. What do you own? Not on paper, not legally, but in practice. Your time, your choices, your direction. Because wealth without control is just another form of dependency, and freedom, real freedom, has nothing to do with money. If stories like this matter to you, stories about hidden power, forgotten fortunes, and the quiet cost of legacy, then this channel is for you. Subscribe, because the most important stories are rarely about how much people had. They're about what they were never allowed to control. And those stories are far from over.